They laughed when a millionaire with only 3 months to live adopted 5 boys from the streets. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Shocking news in the boardroom. The entire boardroom fell silent as Richard Walker closed the door behind him. That day, instead of opening the meeting with numbers and charts, he placed a slender, sealed light brown envelope on the table. It was stamped, Biochemistry Results, New York Presbyterian Hospital. We're not here today to talk about the market or stock codes, Richard began, his voice hoarse but steady. Today, we're here to talk about death. A ripple of unease moved across the faces of directors and advisors. Richard took a deep breath and opened the envelope in front of his protégés. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, 3 months, at best. From his position at the head of the table, he looked down at the familiar faces seated around him. Some looked shocked, others seemed like they wanted to ask something, but no one dared break the silence. Richard closed the folder and stood up straight. For 30 years, I built Walker Global into an empire. I sacrificed nearly everything for it. And now, with only 3 months left to live, I realize I don't know where to go. A beat of silence. I'm stepping down. Now. Immediately. That day, New York was only just entering winter, but the scuff of shoes and thin patches of snow along the streets already hinted at the hard cold to come. Back in his penthouse high above Fifth Avenue, Richard stood in the living room, staring out. The glow of traffic and the blur of people below looked like a river of endless motion. The 40-year-old whiskey he'd saved on the shelf was finally opened, just last week. If I died tomorrow, who would truly mourn? His own question echoed in the hollow space around him. He'd once been proud to live untethered. No one to answer to, no family to disappoint, no emotional burdens. And now, in this luxurious apartment, he was simply a sick, lonely man. Confused and restless, Richard stepped out into the cold night, wandering aimlessly. He passed frozen sidewalks, anonymous faces in a hurry, and bursts of laughter spilling from cafes where families gathered in warmth. Then suddenly, in a narrow alley, Richard stopped. The sight took his breath away. 5 boys were huddled together beneath a torn tarp, using cardboard and loose pages as makeshift covers, barely shielding their knees from the cold. "We don't have anywhere to go," said the oldest, as Richard approached. "But we didn't do anything wrong." In the snow, Richard knelt, his voice trembling. "I have a big house. It's warm. Beds. Food. Just for one night." They looked at one another, uncertain. Then the youngest spoke up. "We can all stay together and leave whenever we want." Richard nodded. And in that moment, after so many years, he felt something entirely new. This wasn't the regret of a man facing his last 3 months. It was the beginning of something else entirely. Knock of a life turned. Knock, knock, knock. The sound echoed off the limo's windshield as it stopped at a midtown traffic light. Richard Walker flinched. His chest still echoed with the doctor's word from just hours earlier. Late-stage pancreatic cancer. Standing outside the car window was a boy, no more than 12, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that shaded half his face. His eyes, sharp and steady, seemed to pierce through the tinted glass, right into the heart of the man inside. "Please don't drive away," the boy said softly. His voice was weak, but not afraid. Before Richard could react, the driver rolled up the window and clicked the lock. "Just another street kid. Happens every Christmas. Same stories." Richard clenched his jaw. Cold. Empty. Then, to the driver's surprise, he said, "Let me out." That street corner, beneath the blinking red light and gentle snowfall, became the mark of something much greater. Just down the alley, lit by a single street lamp, Richard saw not one, but 5 boys huddled together beneath torn cardboard and scattered newspapers. The oldest, maybe 15, stood as Richard approached. "We didn't do anything wrong. This is behind a thrift store. The owner lets us stay." Richard raised a calming hand. "I'm not the police. I just want to know your names." Silence. Then the oldest spoke again. "I'm Ethan. That's Tyler and Thomas." He gestured to the twins. "Lucas, the one with long fingers like an artist. And that's Dylan, the littlest one." Richard nodded. "It's freezing." Why don't you all come to my place just for one night? Think of it as a holiday gift. The boys hesitated, wary. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Just one night. One night, Richard repeated. You can leave whenever you want. Back at Richard's penthouse, an elegant tower of cold marble and glittering chandeliers. 5 small figures stepped softly through the door. They stayed close, like they might vanish if they moved too far apart. Richard removed his coat and gestured toward the kitchen. There's food. Help yourselves. Kitchen's there. Bathroom and bedrooms are at the end of the hall. If you need anything, ring the bell. Dylan looked up at him, hesitant. Aren't you afraid we might steal something? Richard paused, the bottle of whiskey still in midair. His eyes met Dylan's, deep, clear, and honest. And in that moment, he realized this was the first time in decades that someone had asked him a question without flattery or fear, just quiet wonder. I trust you, he said gently. Dylan gave a tiny nod. Then we'll wash our hands first. That night, Richard didn't check his emails. He didn't stand at the window to watch the city lights. Instead, he sat silently at his desk, hand resting on a stack of unopened letters marked only 3 months. From the courtyard below came the sound of laughter and playful bickering. And for the first time in a long time, Richard didn't feel tired, didn't feel sick. He felt something else, that maybe this night wasn't the beginning of the end, but his final chance to come home to himself. A reckless decision. The whole city pushes back. New York greeted dawn with a thin layer of snow, soft as goose down, resting gently on the rooftops of its towering skyline. Inside the penthouse atop Walker Tower, the only sound was the soft clink of silverware on a wooden breakfast table, occasionally interrupted by low murmurs weighed with uncertainty. So, you want to adopt all 5 of them? Attorney Erica Vaughn asked, half laughing as if her client had just offered to sponsor an ice cream truck. Richard didn't smile. I'm serious. Jaden, Caleb, Carter, Mateo, and Liam. I want to legally become their father. Erica's jaw dropped slightly. Richard, you have late-stage cancer. The entire city knows. They're placing bets on your funeral date. A move like this would be a legal and media disaster. Richard stood and walked toward the window. Snow still fell. He exhaled slowly. I know, but sometimes the only things that matter are the ones that sound insane. News of Richard Walker adopting 5 homeless boys spread like wildfire. On the front page, on TV, across every social feed. Dying billionaire adopts 5 street kids. PR stunt or a late act of redemption. The deputy CFO fired off an emergency email. We need an urgent board session before he turns Walker Global into a charity case. Even as the adoption paperwork was being drafted, the boys weren't immediately on board. Jaden pulled his hand away. We're not for sale. Richard knelt in front of them. I know. I was once a poor kid, too. I don't want money to define this. I want to be a family. Mateo eyed him cautiously. But you're dying, and we'll be left again. If I only have 3 months, Richard said softly. I want to spend them with a real family. 3 days later, the boys said yes. At the next board meeting, Richard walked in with the 5 boys at his side. One executive scoffed. Are you here to lead a corporation or start an orphanage? I'm still leading this company, Richard replied, but I refuse to leave behind a legacy of numbers alone. I want history to remember us for our humanity. Then, unexpectedly, Liam raised his hand in the middle of the meeting. We'd like to ask the board something. If you have all the money in the world, but no love, is that really a life worth living? Silence. Richard looked around, meeting each gaze in turn. I might only have 3 months left, but I intend to live them fully. If anyone here disagrees, I'll step down now and transfer all my holdings into a foundation for homeless children. A move that sent shockwaves through the financial world. And that's how Richard Walker began rewriting the legacy of his life. The first breakfast and the first promise. The sharp crash of a pan echoed through the luxurious kitchen, setting off a chain reaction like toppling dominoes. Richard flinched and spun around, only to see Mateo standing frozen, both hands up, a frying pan clattering on the floor at his feet. Oil had spilled everywhere, and broken eggs were smeared across the counter. I just wanted to make sunny-side-up eggs, Matteo stammered, his worried eyes flicking toward Richard. Richard paused, taking a long, steady breath. A week ago, if anyone had made a mess in his kitchen, he would have yelled, demanded cleanup, and called someone to replace them. But today, he calmly stepped forward, knelt down, and picked up the pan. You turned on the heat before adding the oil, didn't you? Matteo nodded. That's why it popped like that, Richard said with a small smile. Let's try again. First lesson of the day. It was their first breakfast together, 7 people preparing a meal with their own hands. The air was festive, filled with the rich scent of cooking oil, the sharp crack of frying eggs, laughter mixing with playful shouting when someone accidentally poured salt into the coffee. Jaden was arguing whether eggs should be fried on high or low heat, while the twin brothers, Caleb and Carter, were competing over who could toast the crispiest bread. Richard stood in the middle of the kitchen, wearing a velvet robe, his hands dusted in flour, and felt, maybe for the first time, truly alive. He wasn't CEO Richard Walker with a schedule packed down to the last minute. He was just a man, learning to be a father. Are you going to die soon? The sudden question from Liam silenced the kitchen. The boy was standing over another pan, carefully cracking eggs, but his eyes were fixed on Richard. Richard drew in a deep breath. Who told you that? I saw the pill bottles in the fridge. Liam shrugged. Didn't have our names. Just yours. Richard didn't respond right away. The kitchen was dead quiet. Finally, he set the pan down, wiped his hands, and walked over to sit across from the boy. Yes, he said softly. The doctor told me I might only have 3 months. 5 sets of eyes froze. Matteo gently set the spatula down. Caleb spilled orange juice across the table. Carter bit his lip. Liam didn't look away. After a pause, he said, Then don't die before you teach us how to make breakfast right. Eggs need low heat. Bread can't burn just cause someone's teasing. Richard burst out laughing. A real, full laugh that shook his chest. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed freely like that. The mess, the noise, it all started from one cracked egg, one simple promise, and yet it felt so deeply binding. I promise, he said, eyes burning with emotion. Every morning after this, there'll be eggs and there'll be smiles. From that day on, Richard's home no longer echoed with the click of high heels from business partners or the stiff clinking of cufflinks from finance execs. It echoed with the laughter of children no one had wanted. A family had begun, with a promise as simple as a fried egg and as sacred as, we'll stay together till the very end. Project Orion, the children and the life or death equation. Richard Walker never imagined that he, a billionaire once in control of boardrooms and empires, would be the one rescued by street kids inside his own home. That day, when he entered the library for a moment of rest, he didn't expect to find Matteo standing before the large drafting board in the corner. What the boy was doing was extraordinary. Matteo had reached up and was sketching a medical blood filtration system in chalk. It wasn't just the detail that stunned Richard, but the perspective corrections. Matteo was revising angles and flow directions Richard hadn't thought about in decades. Matteo, he asked quietly, what are you drawing? The boy turned, a shy light flickering in his eyes. Project Orion, sir. We're trying to find a way to save you. A chill ran down Richard's spine. After months in hospitals with endless tests and cold diagnoses, no one, not even his doctors, had cared like this. In the days that followed, Richard witnessed something he had never dared to believe. 5 street children, souls abandoned by the world, working tirelessly to save the life of a man who had spent most of his years surrounded by power and isolation. Jaden had devoured hundreds of finance texts and was now developing a trend recognition algorithm to raise funds for medical treatment. Caleb and Carter, gifted with code, had designed a new home security system and were now working on a biosimulation model for experimental therapy. Matteo's sketches were evolving into tangible engineering concepts. He was a born designer, translating theory into functional prototypes. And Liam, only 10 years old, had memorized complex biological systems and was poring over dense medical literature. I pretended to faint at the hospital, Liam whispered one evening, so I could meet the top doctor in the field. I had to ask the right questions to get him to drop a clue. Richard was stunned, not just by the brilliance of these kids, but by their dedication, their sacrifices, their quiet, relentless hope. Project Orion became the heart of their lives. The penthouse, once cold, quiet, and formal, was now alive, humming with purpose, collaboration, and courage. And on a night when the city outside turned to sleet and snow, Richard realized something he never saw coming. He was no longer the one giving life. He was being given life by 5 fragile, determined, remarkable lives. And to Richard, that was worth more than any share of stock he had ever owned. The face of betrayal. The quiet mansion nestled in New York's Upper East Side had never expected to become the front line of a silent war. And Richard Walker never imagined the first strike would come from the woman he trusted most. That morning started like any other. Richard had just finished an exhausting round of treatment when Caleb entered the room, pale and shaken, holding a laptop. "You need to see this." On the screen was a grainy audio clip pulled from the private security system that Caleb and Carter had secretly installed in Richard's office after word of his illness leaked to the press. A familiar voice played, calm, deliberate, with a hint of caution. "He's getting weaker, Mason. This is the perfect time to make your offer. Don't wait." Richard froze. It was Brenda Clarkson, his personal assistant of 25 years. The woman who had been with him since Walker Global was just a single-floor office above a laundromat. Caleb looked unsure. "Are you okay?" Richard nodded slightly, then motioned for all 5 boys to join him in the living room. Minutes later, they were gathered around him like a seasoned team, Jaden with his notepad, Caleb and Carter with laptops, Mateo sitting cross-legged by the fireplace, and little Liam clutching his worn-out teddy bear. Richard told them everything, openly, honestly, without dressing it up. The betrayal wasn't just a knife to the back. It was a reminder that the world out there didn't offer second chances. "So what do we do now?" Mateo asked, eyes wide and shimmering. "Do we fight back?" "No," Richard replied quietly. His voice was tired, but his gaze was sharper than ever. "We don't strike back. We protect. We protect what we love, this company, and this family." And the plan began. Richard officially handed over temporary control of key parts of his life to the 5 boys. Jaden, the 15-year-old with an uncanny understanding of market trends, became Richard's proxy in strategic meetings. He wasn't CEO, but his voice carried the weight of someone who mattered. Caleb and Carter, the tech-savvy twins, overhauled the mansion's and company's security systems, building an encrypted network impenetrable to outsiders. Every cyber attack from competitors was neutralized in seconds. Mateo, the quiet young artist, became the house's visual storyteller. He drew everyday moments inside the home, tender, candid snapshots of a man fighting for life with 5 children he chose to love. Liam, the youngest, was unofficially dubbed the medical coordinator. He read Richard's health files, learned how to monitor his fatigue levels, and even assisted with basic procedures. Day by day, Richard faded from being the boss and became something else, a mentor, a father. One evening, as the mansion glowed in warm light and snow dusted the yard, Jaden entered the library. Richard was sitting by the window, watching the quiet snowfall. "Do you think we're strong enough?" Jaden asked, not with doubt, but genuine concern. Richard looked at him. "There was a time I believed strength came from money. Then I lost my wife, lost time, nearly lost myself. Now I think real strength is believing in others." Jaden smiled gently. "So you believe in us now?" Richard didn't answer. Instead, he stood, walked to a bookshelf, and pulled down a small wooden box. Inside were the controlling shares of Walker Global. He placed Jaden's hand on top of the box. "Not today," Richard said, "but one day, this will be yours. Not because I'm dying, but because I see something in you that the world never bothered to see." Jaden swallowed hard, words caught in his throat. The next day, the media exploded. Billionaire Richard Walker appoints street kids as interim advisors of his empire. People laughed. They called it a stunt. They called him a dying man who'd lost his mind. But inside the mansion, Amid sketches, market charts, medical notes, and shared home-cooked meals, Richard felt something he had never fully understood in his 59 years of life. Family doesn't have to look the same. It just has to never give up on each other. Market storm and the final pact. Turn on the TV, Caleb. Now. Richard Walker's voice cracked through the quiet hall, sharp with urgency, something rare since his terminal diagnosis. The clock read 7:48 a.m., and over New York, a heavy gray sky loomed like a curtain before a coming storm. Caleb grabbed the remote and flicked on the screen. Breaking news banners flashed in red. Dow Jones plunges 2,000 points in 1 hour. Liquidity crisis spreads across central banks. S&P 500 suffers worst drop since 2008. Carter rushed in, his fingers still stained with ink from working on algorithm drafts overnight. It's starting, exactly like we modeled. His voice was hoarse from exhaustion, but his eyes burned with clarity. Richard stared at the screen, then turned to the twins. How long before everything crashes? 72 hours without major corporate intervention, Caleb replied. But if we act within the next 48 hours, we can still contain most of the damage. Liam, clutching Richard's medical files, exhaled softly. So, no rest for you today, huh? Mateo entered with a mug of ginger tea, placing it gently in front of Richard. Bad news spreads fast. The media is asking why Walker Global hasn't responded yet. They're saying, you're too weak. Richard gave a faint smile. Then it's time to prove them wrong. Call Jaden. We need a plan. The 42nd floor conference room, once the heart of billion-dollar deals, was now a crisis command center. Jaden, wearing a blazer he still looked shy in, stood before a wall of charts and live data. Based on Caleb and Carter's model, Jaden began, voice steady despite his 15 years. The market will continue crashing for another 36 hours. Hedge funds and digital banks, without sufficient liquidity, are the most vulnerable. Richard nodded. And if we use our algorithm to redirect capital flow, we can stabilize key companies and generate enough return to reinvest into community infrastructure. Carter chimed in, but we'll face opposition. The ones clinging to the old system won't go quietly. Mateo agreed. They'll hit back with everything: media, politics, legal threats. Richard stood, his body still weak, but his presence firm. He buttoned his vest and adjusted his cuffs. Then let them see. This isn't a dying man acting alone. It's a family, 5 children and 1 former fool, standing up to do what's right. At 2 p.m., a message came in. Sender, Mason Trent. Meet me. Urgent. I need you. Jaden looked at Richard. You don't have to go. He tried to buy out your company while you were in the hospital. That's exactly why I need to go. To hear what weapon he's using now, and to offer him one deal. The cafe near Bryant Park was unusually quiet. Mason Trent, the former co-founder of Walker Global turned ruthless competitor, sat trembling with a black coffee in hand. Richard, I need you. I know. My credit lines are frozen. Stocks are down 60% in half a day. Investors are running. I have no way out. I assume this meeting isn't just for reciting stats. Mason looked up. Save me. Like we used to save each other back in the day. One last partnership. Richard stared deep into the eyes of the man who had once been a brother, and later a traitor. I'll help, but only on one condition. Mason blinked. Money? Shares? Name it. Not money. The future. If you want my help, you'll agree to divert 30% of the Trent ecosystem's annual profit into the Orion Fund, a nonprofit focused on education and rehabilitation for homeless children. And you'll offer full-ride scholarships to at least 500 children each year. You're joking. That's over $100 million a year. And I'm sitting across from a man who may lose everything in 24 hours. I'm not joking. That afternoon, the financial world shook at the news of a 2-hour private meeting between Richard Walker and Mason Trent. Media outlets scrambled to decode what had happened. Then, from Walker Global's official Twitter account, a single line was posted. It's time to save not just the market, but the generation to come. Hashtag #OrionPact. That night, back at the penthouse, Richard walked into the living room where the boys were waiting. Liam rushed up and hugged him tightly. You okay? The news was a lot. I'm fine, Richard said, his voice tired but warm. And we just gained an ally. Mateo asked, can we trust him? No, Richard replied honestly. But the agreement will be legally enforced under the transparency system Caleb and Carter built. Jaden stepped forward and handed Richard a folder. And this is the expansion blueprint for the Orion Fund. Nationwide rollout, data, scholarships, and community health outreach. Richard took it, his eyes scanning every page, every chart, every bullet point. Then he looked up. We're not just a family anymore. We're hope. Outside, the skies began to clear. And inside that home, 5 once-forgotten children were rewriting what it meant to leave behind a legacy. The terms that shook Wall Street. If you want to be saved, learn how to save others. Richard Walker. The wail of an ambulance echoed down Fifth Avenue, but was drowned out by something even louder. The thunderclap from a live press conference streaming out of the Walker Global Tower. Is this some kind of joke? Veteran investor Thomas Ellison blurted out as the first clause lit up the massive LED screen. 30% of annual net profits will be allocated to the Underserved Children's Education Fund. Then came the second clause. A minimum of 20% of board seats must be reserved for individuals who have experienced poverty. And finally, the twist no one saw coming. All companies receiving bailout support must provide 1,000 full-ride scholarships annually to underprivileged youth for at least 10 years. Confusion swept the room until a man stepped up to the podium, a fresh injection mark still visible on his left arm. Richard Walker, the man the press had called the dying billionaire just months ago. He looked directly into the camera. His voice was low, raspy but firm. I once believed I was untouchable because I had everything. But 5 boys who used to sleep in garbage alleys taught me this. The value of a life isn't in what you keep, it's in what you give away. The room fell into stunned silence. Jaden, in a fitted gray suit, stood at Richard's right side like a true right hand. Caleb and Carter adjusted the broadcast equipment. Mateo and Liam worked behind the scenes in the control room, eyes bright. This wasn't just a press conference. This was a revolution. 6 months ago, they were nameless children with no home. Now, they were rewriting the rules of global finance. That afternoon, Walker Global's inbox exploded. Messages, calls, and emails flooding in. Half were filled with outrage and ridicule. The other half were tears. One retired CEO from Texas wrote, I lost my daughter because I couldn't afford her college tuition. If your proposal passes, maybe thousands of kids won't have to face what I did. That night, Richard sat by the library window, sipping tea instead of whiskey. After his second round of chemotherapy, he'd given up alcohol altogether. Liam, the youngest, approached, carrying a thick medical textbook. You know, Liam mumbled, I thought Wall Street would crush us. We're not fighting them. Richard replied gently. We're inviting them to do the right thing. Jaden came in holding a fax. You should see this. It was a letter. From Mason Trent. Richard, maybe I misjudged you and those kids. But if you're truly trying to make a difference, let me stand beside you. I'll commit 15% of our profits to the fund, and I'll add a disadvantaged child to our internal scholarship program. Call me when you're ready. Richard placed a hand on Jaden's shoulder. See that? Not everyone loses the ability to change. Not even an old rival. 3 weeks later, 17 companies had signed the agreement. Some of them had previously refused to support any social cause. The media split down the middle. Cheap PR stunt. CNBC. A direct hit to the heart of Wall Street. Powered by hope. The New York Times. One late afternoon, Mateo entered Richard's office, holding an iPad. You should see this. On the screen was a design Mateo had just completed. The official emblem of the New Generation Foundation. A large adult hand lifting 5 tiny feet, with a map of the United States draped like a protective quilt overhead. Richard stared at it, tears silently falling. Mateo, I don't know how much time I have left, but if this is the last thing I leave behind, it'll be the first thing we carry forward, Mateo whispered, eyes glistening. On the last night of the month, as New York quieted under the winter sky, the 6 of them gathered in the library. No charts. No meetings, just tea, cookies, and stories. Caleb shared how he once got kicked out of a public library because he didn't have a home address. Jaden remembered how he used panhandled money to buy a finance book instead of food. Mateo described how he first learned to draw, using dirt on concrete. Carter spoke of his dream to one day have a house with stable Wi-Fi. And Liam, the 10-year-old who never said much, simply whispered, "I used to think I didn't exist." Richard pulled all 5 of them into his arms. "I used to think that too." Outside, Wall Street was still glowing, still bustling. But inside one penthouse, a new kind of history was being written, not by power, but by love. The doorbell and the weight of forgiveness. The doorbell rang at 6 a.m. on a late winter morning. Richard Walker was still in bed. The oxygen tube was still clipped beneath his nose, and his cough had become a grim metronome, marking time left to live. Jaden was the first to rise. He opened the door and saw a scene that looked like something from film. Brenda, Richard's assistant for 25 years, the woman who had betrayed him, stood on the front porch. She wore an old knit hat. Her face was frozen in that strange expression of someone trying to cry and failing. "May I speak to him?" she asked, her eyes never meeting Jaden's. Jaden simply nodded, uncertain. Though suspicion burned in his chest, he swallowed it and said quietly, "Wait here." Inside, Richard was struggling to sit up, trying to reach his medication. Liam, just 10 years old, was helping him, his tiny hands steady, as if carrying the weight of a lifetime. "Brenda's at the door," Jaden said softly. Richard paused mid-cough, then was silent for a few seconds. Finally, he said only, "Let her in." Brenda entered the room as quietly as a shadow. When she saw him sitting there, his skin pale, lips faded from medication, she choked up instantly. "I have nothing left to say but 2 words. I'm sorry." Richard nodded slowly, his eyes still watery from the last coughing fit. "I didn't think you'd ever want to look me in the eye again. I thought Mason would stand by me," she said, voice shaking. "Turns out I was just a pawn. I traded 25 years of loyalty for something that never existed." The room was silent. Liam quietly stepped out, but paused just outside the doorway. "Why do you want to come back?" Richard asked. "Because my soul can't sleep. I'm not asking for a title. I just want to stand somewhere near what you and the boys are building. I want to help." Liam re-entered. He looked at Brenda, then turned to Richard. "Are you forgiving her because you're weak, or because you're strong?" The question hit like a soft hammer. Richard looked at Liam, then at Brenda. "Because I don't want hatred living in my heart. Because life is too short to carry that kind of weight." Brenda dropped to her knees, sobbing. Liam walked over and placed his small hand gently on her shoulder. 1 month later, Brenda stood in the middle of a special session for the youth reintegration program. A 17-year-old girl with scars on her wrists stared at her like she was a stranger. "You messed up that badly?" the girl asked. Brenda nodded. "And I'm starting over. You can too." Outside the room, Richard watched through the glass. Jaden stood beside him. Richard said quietly, "Forgiveness isn't because they deserve it. It's because our hearts deserve peace." The clock, the flowers, and a life reborn. The ticking of the wall clock echoed differently that morning. Slower, softer, almost reverent. The entire Orion Center was wrapped in a silence unlike any other day. Towering glass walls reflected the rows of children holding white flowers, standing patiently in line. You're not mistaken. Today, March 27th, was the official opening of the Orion Foundation, the century's most innovative research, education, and empowerment hub for underserved children and young visionaries. As the ceremonial ribbon cutting was about to begin and the governor anxiously searched for Richard Walker, he was nowhere in sight. Then, the doors to the auditorium quietly opened, and he appeared. Richard Walker, now 60, entered to stunned silence. He moved slowly, but each step was deliberate. His hair had turned silver, his skin bore deeper lines, but his eyes had never shone brighter. From a seat, Mason Trent started clapping first, subdued, hesitant, and then others followed. Board members, children, teachers, doctors, journalists. One by one, the whole room rose in silence. Jaden, wearing a crisp blue shirt, gently pointed to the leather chair at center stage. "Your seat, sir." And Richard sat between the lights and the legacy. The ceremony unfolded, but in Richard's mind, the speeches and glass Orion sculpture faded in the background. What he saw most clearly was Liam's small hand in his. "You're shaking," the boy whispered. Richard smiled, and for the first time that morning, his breath caught, not from pain but from joy. In the video presentation summarizing the Orion Protocol's journey, the audience watched the story of one man's fall from certainty into despair and his rise into hope. Hospital beds, failed trials, then a breakthrough. Jaden stood and spoke. This project didn't just save Richard Walker. It will save millions. Offstage, Mason leaned in toward Richard. "You did something I never thought possible. You changed New York without a threat." Richard replied, calm and certain, "I just saved the kids I once believed were saving me." As the ceremony closed, Mateo walked Richard through the garden. "Remember the first time you saw us? In that frozen alley?" "Yes, very clearly," Richard said. "Back then, we thought we were just getting one warm night. Who would have imagined this?" Richard paused beneath the Orion sculpture, aglow with LED lights and surrounded by murals Mateo had painted. One cold night changed everything for all of us. Later that evening, back home, Richard opened an email. It was from a young boy in Indonesia, a new recipient of Orion's outreach program. "You became a father to me, even though you don't know my name." Richard closed the laptop and placed his hand gently over his heart. In the story of a man who thought he had lived long enough, Richard Walker was still being born, every day, through love, through trust, through shared footsteps. Because now he finally understood. Life isn't about being remembered. It's about remembering that you truly loved, once with everything you had. The rain, the sirens, and the firewall of trust. The blare of ambulance sirens cut through the pouring rain like an alarm for the soul. Manhattan pulsed with chaos, red and blue lights flashing as dozens of police cruisers and news vans surrounded a high-rise tower. On the 48th floor, inside the Orion Foundation's data center, a cyber attack was underway. Caleb sat hunched over the server terminal, fingers flying across the keyboard, sweat pouring down his brow. "Someone's using a corrupted passkey to breach the system," he said, breath tight. "They have near-root level access." Carter froze mid-thought. "No way. Don't tell me." The door opened. Richard Walker stepped in, holding a mug of hot tea. It was the middle of the night, yet he looked more composed than anyone in the room, his eyes distant, yet razor-sharp. "It's the old shareholders," he said quietly. "I figured they wouldn't sit quietly while Orion outgrew them." The breach was being led by a rogue faction, headed by Randall Price, a former defense contractor, turned venture predator. Their goal: to wipe the original Orion protocol, the AI-based humanitarian infrastructure Richard and the boys had spent years building. Whispers of a new, unrestricted version of Orion, controlled by Price, had already leaked to the press. Carter turned to Caleb. "The decoy version we tested. The one with the vulnerability. Could we flip it back on him?" Caleb's eyes lit up. "Congratulations, big brother. It's time for Orion to outsmart Orion." 3 hours later, with headlines swirling about a possible leadership coup at Orion, Richard convened an emergency executive meeting. "I won't let Randall Price hijack this dream," Richard said, slamming his palm on the table. "We built Orion for children, not for Wall Street to gut and flip." Mateo projected a new interface onto the screen. "This is Orion Phantom," he said. "It's a mirrored replica, launched at exactly midnight. If Price tries to access it, he'll trigger a honey trap, and we'll trace every move." From the back of the room, Jaden stood up, silent no more. "I've already contacted the SEC. All stock transactions tied to Price have been frozen. He has no way out." 3 days later, on NBC's Morning Report, Orion Foundation defeats hostile takeover with phantom AI strategy. Trust prevails over greed. The press conference photo of Richard, standing tall beside the 5 boys, dominated front pages nationwide. Later that night, Richard looked at the printed photo on his desk. He placed it gently into Liam's small hands, then said softly, "We didn't just build a project. We rebuilt something this world forgot how to believe in. Trust." The alarm, the child, and the reason to breathe again. The alarm blared through the ICU hallway, slicing through the hours of stillness like a siren of fate. Liam jolted upright, his small palm clutching Richard Walker's cold, unmoving hand. The machines buzzed and beeped in chaotic rhythm, like a funeral hymn sung in ones and zeros, each number flickering on the monitor whispering, "He's slipping away." For the first time ever, all 5 boys sat in silence. No arguments, no teasing, no jostling for space over something foolish. Jaden gripped his special notebook, the one filled with budget plans for a future they all believed in. Mateo stared blankly at a sketch of their dream building, a place where poor children wouldn't just learn, but learn to love. Caleb and Carter, usually so composed, sat hunched over Liam's fallen game console, not speaking, their fingers twitching only to distract from the fear. "God," Liam whispered, eyes rimmed red. "There's no way Richard's dying because of a mislabeled dosage." The hospital had left just one door open, the one reserved for those preparing to say goodbye. And Richard lay behind it. Not even 20 minutes ago, he'd been calmly walking the team through the fallout of the Orion Protocol hack. Now, the first person in the room to panic wasn't a doctor. It was a 10-year-old boy. Liam took a deep breath and dove into Richard's personal data vault using his brother's custom tablet, programmed with emergency access just for him. Morphine dosage spiked nearly 60% above protocol, he called out. "That's an error. It needs to be corrected now." The on-call physician turned sharply. "What did you just say, kid?" "I said if we adjust it now, we can reverse the opioid spike in under 8 minutes, before it triggers neural suppression or respiratory failure." "And how exactly do you know that?" Liam stared back, steady and unblinking. "Because I read the Orion Protocol." And in that moment, no one in the room, not even the 60-year-old attending physician, could deny the clarity in Liam's voice. 1 hour later, when Richard Walker took his first unaided breath, the first thing he saw wasn't a doctor, or a security guard, or a miracle drug. It was a child holding his hand, eyes still wet with tears. "Liam, I didn't let a faulty algorithm take away the man who taught me how to make eggs." Liam's voice trembled. "I used to think I didn't need a father. But if I did, I want him to be like you." Richard couldn't speak. His chest heaved with something no oxygen machine could deliver. A love he'd never expected, and a life he'd almost lost. And in that fragile, precious moment, he knew. It didn't matter that he'd been sick, or betrayed, or broken beneath the weight of titles and wealth. Because right now, something was beginning again. Sometimes, to live again, all we need is one reason to turn back toward life. And that reason, he realized, was wrapped tightly around his fingers, in the shape of a tiny hand, refusing to let go. The price of humanity. The clang of the judge's gavel echoed through the courtroom. "Mr. Richard Walker, please rise." The room fell silent, eerily so, save for the sound of shuffling papers and murmurs of judgmental stares from the gallery. In the front row, 5 boys, Jaden, Caleb, Carter, Mateo, and Liam, sat side by side, hands tightly, clasped together. The 8 a.m. headline that morning had shaken the nation. CEO Richard Walker under investigation for exploiting guardianship laws for personal gain and manipulating vulnerable children. A prosecutor placed a thick file on the bench. "Mr. Walker," she asked, voice sharp, "are you telling this court that adopting 5 street children wasn't a calculated move to cleanse your public image?" Richard looked directly at her. No fear, no anger, just gravity. His voice was low, raspy, and firm. "I'm dying. And when a man is dying, he's not looking to polish a reputation. He's looking to know, just once, that he did something right before he runs out of time." The judge nodded and called the first witness. Jaden stood. He looked older than just 3 years ago, taller, steadier. Dressed in a modest suit, he walked to the witness stand with quiet confidence, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore the oath. "My name is Jaden Walker. I didn't have a last name before. A hush rippled across the courtroom. Jaden didn't flinch. He turned to face Richard, his gaze steady and deep. People say Richard saved us. But no, he asked us something no one else ever did. Who do you want to become? And then he listened. Jaden paused, took a slow breath, and continued. We didn't need a savior. We needed a father. And he was the only one brave enough to believe in kids like us. The room remained silent. Then Mateo approached the stand, his voice soft but sure. When I messed up my drawings, he didn't yell. He just said, let's try it a different way next time. In a house full of space and silence, he gave me patience. Finally, Liam, just 10 years old but with eyes that had seen too much, stepped forward. Most people looked at me like trash. They said I was just another burden. But Mr. Richard said, he's just looking for someone brave enough to love him. He loved us before we even knew how to love ourselves. The courtroom stood still. Then, slowly, one by one, every person in the courtroom rose to their feet as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. This court recognizes these children as the legal family of Richard Walker. The petition is dismissed. Richard looked around. Surrounded by strangers, he realized he no longer felt alone. The weight in his chest had changed. No longer pain, but peace. His heart had found its way home. The rain in Nairobi and the seeds of forever. It poured all morning in Nairobi. In a narrow alley behind Kibera, where children wore newspaper for shoes and plastic bottles for toys, an 8-year-old boy stood still, staring up at a newly nailed sign. Orion Creativity Center, where dreams don't require documents. His name was Samuel. Orphaned at 3, he had never learned to read. But that day, under a pounding rain, he stepped through a rusted metal gate, barefoot, his feet caked in mud. What he didn't know was that half a world away, an aging man named Richard Walker was watching the moment unfold on a live stream, tears silently welling in his eyes. He's crying, Liam whispered, seeing Richard grip the edge of his chair. The same Liam who once sat beneath Richard's feet when he was too weak to stand, now stood tall, dressed in a crisp white shirt, serving as Orion's official spokesperson at the Kenya opening. Jaden gently placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. It was just one seed, but you planted it in the right soil. Only a year ago, Orion was still a wild idea born in the penthouse dining room. Now it had reached 11 countries, from Vietnam to Colombia, India to Poland. Each center was designed, operated, or taught by the very children who once had no homes. Mateo, the architect of emotion, designed not just with his hands but with memory. Low ceilings that once trapped heat, walls once scribbled with dreams. He created open spaces flooded with light, desks built low for disabled children, and floor-to-ceiling windows, so even kids standing outside the gate could see in. It was his way of saying, no one gets left behind. Caleb and Carter, always in motion, split travel duties, bringing STEM learning to underserved corners of the world. Robots made from soda cans, rebuilt laptops, whiteboards made of painted aluminum. These slum kids didn't need fancy tech. They needed someone to believe in them first. Liam, once a boy who clutched pill bottles in Richard's home, now led Orion's grassroots medical programs. He didn't prescribe drugs. He spoke with mothers, listened to malnourished kids, and quietly crafted a 50-cent-a-day nutrition plan that actually worked. In Houston, Brenda, the woman who once betrayed Richard, now oversaw Orion's reintegration program. She worked with single mothers, addicts, and the forgotten. No one asked her about her past. They only saw a woman who walked the halls every morning, quietly placing warm food trays outside each door. Meanwhile, Richard kept watching. In his worn leather notebook, he wrote everything. Samuel, Nairobi. First to read the sign. Tran Thi Heng, Vietnam. Wrote her first poem at Orion. To him, every name was proof, not of wealth, but of what he'd once forgotten. People are not defined by bank balances, but by their ability to see goodness in others. That night, the boys hosted a small dinner at the old penthouse. It no longer echoed with silence. Now its walls were covered in letters from around the world, drawings of Orion centers, thank you notes in dozens of languages, and crayon portraits of Richard, clumsy, colorful, and full of love. Remember when we snuck chocolate in the kitchen? Mateo grinned. I don't recall, Richard replied, mock stern. But I do remember someone spilling an entire pot of noodles on my leather sofa. Liam, now sitting beside him, looked up with glistening eyes. But now we know how to cook. And clean, too. As the lights dimmed, Caleb played one last video. On the wall appeared a 4-year-old girl in Syria, tracing a circle in the sand with her finger, giggling. This is my home. Orion is my home. No one spoke. Richard wrapped his arms around all 5 boys. His chest was heavy, not with sickness, but with so much joy he feared it might break him. Tomorrow, he'd board another flight to another country. But tonight, in what was once the loneliest place of his life, he had a family and a world slowly changing because of small seeds planted with love and redemption. Far beyond the window, a soft roll of thunder whispered through the night. But inside that room, there was only the sound of laughter and the quiet thump of a man's heart, who once lived to own the world, and now lived to give it away. And only that lasts forever. A Father's Day that was never meant to be. The doorbell rang 3 sharp times, followed by barking dogs and a gust of cold air rushing down the wide hallway. Richard Walker had never been fond of unannounced visitors, especially not on Saturday mornings, the time he reserved for reading, sipping coffee, and reflecting on things money could never buy. But this time, when the heavy oak door creaked open, it wasn't a stranger standing outside. It was Liam, the youngest in the special family Richard had built, holding a sunflower bouquet nearly bigger than himself. Behind him stood Jaden, Caleb, Carter, and Mateo, each holding a carefully wrapped box. Sewn onto every coat was a small hand-stitched badge that read, Dad. Happy Father's Day, Richard, Jaden said, voice trembling, perhaps from the cold, or perhaps from what he was about to say. We know you don't celebrate these kinds of days, but today is an exception. Richard froze. He had never expected a celebration. To him, existence itself was a gift, and gratitude was something best kept quietly within. But looking into those bright eyes, 5 pairs, all shimmering, he knew he couldn't turn them away. A soft chuckle escaped his lips. Then, silently, the tears followed. The living room was soaked in gentle sunlight. On the table lay the now opened gifts. A hand-knitted wool tie from Mateo, a custom 3D printed photo frame from Carter and Caleb, a wooden financial model crafted by Jaden in the garage, and a handwritten nutrition guide from Liam, which included a note. No more hot dogs. They're bad for your liver. All 6 sat around the breakfast table. Richard didn't say much. He just stared at each face. Faces that had once lived in the shadows of the city and now lit up the center of his world. I still remember the night we met, Caleb said, swirling his cup of cocoa. I thought you were crazy. Who invites 5 filthy kids into a penthouse? You were crazy, Carter chimed in. But like the good kind of crazy. Laughter filled the room, a lightness none of them could name. Richard chuckled hoarsely and turned to Liam. What about you? Planning to make me give up coffee next? Nope, Liam grinned. As long as it's organic. And no sugar. That afternoon, while the boys rushed around prepping a small party, Richard quietly slipped into the library. He opened a drawer and pulled out an old photo, the only one left of Sarah, his wife, taken before cancer took her over a decade ago. You see, he whispered, I finally learned how to live. Not to build an empire, but to open a heart. He placed a photo next to a new one. Him and the 5 boys, smiling outside Orion Foundation on its opening day. That photo had everything. Laughter, light, and something deeper unspoken. Maybe hope. When dinner began, Richard was invited to sit in the center seat, the one he always avoided for fear of being too seen. This time, he didn't decline. Mateo gave a short speech, then turned on the large screen in the living room. A video played, secret clips the boys had recorded over time. Richard quietly fixing a staircase at midnight so Mateo wouldn't trip. Richard S.